right. Welcome to week 4 of our B90X discussion of our reading. Give me 1 second while I get things adjusted here on my workspace. Today we're going to be covering a lot of historical ground. We're going to be looking at Ruth through pretty much the end of 1 Kings. A lot of great history is found there. So with that in mind, we'll probably be not going over a tremendous amount of details. Instead, we'll be focusing on the highlights and hitting those pretty hard. So anybody that ends up joining us in the discussions, feel free to discuss. We would love to have you in here discussing the reading from this week. And just like I said last week, don't think that just because you didn't get in on this at the beginning that that you can't join us at any point in time. So today's we'll go through Ruth chapter 1 through 1 Kings chapter into chapter 14. Next week's discussion will be over 1 Kings chapter 15 all the way through 2 Chronicles, the end of 2 Chronicles chapter 13. So today we're going to be going over primarily formation of the kingdom of Israel. I guess the territory of Israel has been established, but their formal earthly kingdom is established. We're going to look at Ruth and her story a little bit, and really focus a lot on the dysfunction that was constantly a part of Israel in its time of existence. So let's get started with that, and let me get my my program here back to the book of Ruth. So we started in Ruth. It's interesting that this Ruth person, who she ends up being and how important she ends up being when we think about our salvation, as she would be the super duper extra double great grandmother of Jesus Christ himself, the grandmother of David. So she played an important role in Jewish history, yet she was not a Jew by birth. We read in chapter 1, verse 15, and she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after to your sister-in-law." This is Ruth's mother-in-law telling her to go back because her husband, Ruth's father-in-law, Ruth's husband, and Ruth's brother-in-law, her sister's husband, had all died. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. As we continue to read the story of Ruth, we learn that she will, in fact, willfully part from Naomi at some point in the future, but it's through marriage and through honorable means. We read a little bit more about her relationship with Boaz in chapter 2, starting in verse 10. "Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?' But Boaz answered her, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.'" So Ruth's reputation really preceded her. She had not abandoned her mother-in-law in her mother-in-law's time of need. She had instead abandoned all that she knew and chose to follow after Naomi and help Naomi in any way she possibly could. And it's because of this that she found favor in the sight of Boaz. So her reputation preceded her and Boaz looked favorably upon her, and that ended up allowing her to be fed. It would eventually end up leading to a relationship with Boaz, as we can read in chapter 4, which is basically the end of the book of Ruth. In verse 16, then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, let's start in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So Ruth having the distinction of being the great-grandmother of David. So, which would ultimately lead up to her being in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So, very important story there. Only 4 chapters long. Was a really quick read, and just a great story about devotion to family and really how we choose to act and how our reputation, based upon what we choose to do, will precede us. Really, no matter where we go. Next, we have 1 Samuel, and we'll go through 1 and 2 Samuel and most of 1 Kings today. Chapter 1, we get the birth of Samuel in verse 30. And in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. Hannah had a hard time with having children, had not had any until this point, and really regarded Samuel as a gift, one that she would eventually end up giving back to the Lord. So, and that's what we see there again at the end of chapter 1. Hannah is faithful and has a pretty good prayer there, recorded in Samuel. But more importantly, the sons of Eli were regarded as worthless men. We can see that in chapter 2, verse 12. Now, the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. And skipping down to verse 21, indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. So we see Samuel continuing to grow here. He's been dedicated to the service of God. So he is really more of a follower in the steps of Eli than any of Eli's sons are. In verse 22 and following, Eli would continue to rebuke his sons because they were behaving in a terrible fashion. And eventually it would be so bad that in chapter 2, the Lord would just simply reject all of Eli's household. And in chapter 3, we pick up where Samuel is called by the Lord. In verse 19, and Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall on the ground. It's interesting to look at really how God looks at Samuel here, and that he didn't let Samuel make any errors. So, you think about the guy that always says the right thing and never messes up. And that's who Samuel was, and he was that way because God made him that way in verse 19 there of chapter 3. The people of Israel at this time were very wicked. They were not a righteous people, and the ark would end up being captured. And that, of course, would be a bad thing for Israel. But the Philistines in chapter 4 capture the ark. We see the death of Eli here. In verse 17, it says of chapter 4, he who brought the news answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among the people. Your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. So we see here he had been a judge of Israel for a very long time. And it didn't, the news of the Ark of the Covenant falling into the hands of the Philistines certainly did not bode well with him, coupled with the fact that his own sons had perished. He would have been devastated at that news, I imagine. Let's see. The Philistines don't really have a whole lot of luck with this ark that they captured. They put it next to one of their gods because they look at the ark as a god itself when it's not. And their god was Dagon. And basically Dagon doesn't fare very well. He starts to fall to pieces. So they get the ark away from Dagon because it obviously has a negative impact on the false gods sitting next to it. And the people that were involved also had a lot of trouble with tumors and other things. So the ark would not stay with the Philistines very long before they would very happily return it to Israel. It was only in chapter 6, verse 1, the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. And the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us with what we shall send it to its place." So they basically cart it back to Israel. We still see here Samuel judging Israel. So this is before Israel has a physical king. Their king at this point is God alone and should be that way, but they have different ideas about what should go on. Samuel sits in judgment, and we find out that he actually ends up moving around the nation and judging in several different places, but he always ends up in Ramah. That's his home. It's his favorite place. That's where he spends the majority of his time. It's where we'll find out later that he ends up dying. It's a very important place to him. In chapter 8, verse 1, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judge over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. I don't know if you remember the discussion from, I think it was last week. It was last week. It was in Deuteronomy. And it was one of the things that was very important in the second telling of the law. And it was important in the first telling of the law too, in Exodus, but in the second telling it was all emphasized multiple times. And that is the exercising of proper judgment without regard to status or payment. And the sons of Samuel were not so much different than the sons of Eli, in that they both ended up being evil in how they really handled their job. So it didn't work out well for them either. Oops, still having problems with my program collapsing here. All right, so Samuel tells them, "Hey, king's a really bad idea." But the Lord grants Israel's request, basically saying, "Yeah, you're going to get what you want, and you're going to regret it." Saul is chosen as their king. It's interesting when we look at Saul, we really have two different pictures of Saul. His original demeanor is very different than the Saul that he turns into by the time we get into the book of 2 Samuel. Saul answered, "Am I not a Benjamite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then have you spoken to me in this way?" Then Samuel took Saul and his young man and brought them into the hall and gave them a place at the head of those who had been invited, who were about 30 persons. And Samuel said to the cook, "Bring the portion I gave you, of which I said to you, put it aside." So the cook took up the leg that was on it and set them before Saul. And Samuel said, "See, what was kept is set before you. Eat, because it was kept for you until this hour appointed, that you might eat with the guests." So Saul ate with Samuel that day. And when they came down from the high place into the city, a bed was spread for Saul on the roof, and he lay down to sleep. Then at the break of dawn, Samuel called to Saul on the roof, "Up, that I may send you on your way." So Saul arose, both he and Samuel, and they went into the street. As they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to pass on before us. And when he has passed on, stop here yourself for a while, that I may make known to you the word of God." So this is where he'll actually be anointed as king in chapter 10. Verse 9, when he turned his back to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart. And all these signs came to pass that day when they came to Gibeah. Behold, a group of prophets met him, and the Spirit of God rushed upon him, and he prophesied among them. And when all who knew him previously saw how he prophesied with the prophets, the people said to one another, "What has come over the son of Kish? Is Saul among the prophets?" So we see here God specifically anointing Saul as king. And the actual proclamation in chapter 10, verse 24, and Saul said to all the people, "Do you see him who the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." This is really kind of the ultimate insult. They have a king, and they have rejected their king for one that they can look at and one that they can talk to, not just in prayer, but face to face. So they really accepted a lower standard and are embracing this lower standard of what a king is. In verse 25, then Samuel told the people the rights and the duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. Then Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his home. Saul also went to his home at Gibeah, and with him went men of valor whose hearts God had touched. But some worthless fellows said, "How can this man save us?" And they despised him and brought him no present, but he held his peace. So we see here that Saul has really not let this thing go to his head, which is a good trait, at least at this part in his life. Saul would then go on to defeat the Ammonites, and he renews the kingdom in chapter 12. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is it that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring them in, that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal," and there renewed the kingdom. So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal there. They sacrificed peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all men of Israel rejoiced greatly. You see here that the people that had supported Saul really wanted to go in and just remove all the doubters, basically. And that's not what Saul wanted. Saul wanted instead everybody to be forgiven and rejoice in their victory and the renewing of God's kingdom. Samuel gives his farewell address here in chapter 12. And we see here in verse 23, just a really important attitude to have, I think. "Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, and I will instruct you in the good and right way." Samuel was not on Saul's side. He did not want Saul to be king. He didn't want there to be a king. Yet he realized that his place was not to make that judgment. His place was to do as the Lord instructed, and not only that, but to pray for what the Lord had instructed. So hold on one sec here. We have another crash of the program, but I'll pull it back up again. So now we have in the next chapter, the 13, Saul's going to fight the Philistines. And this is a story that's often told in Bible classes. A lot of these stories are. There's a lot of Bible class stories from this part of the Bible. But one of the interesting things here happens in verse 10. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, this is Saul offering the burnt offering because he couldn't wait for Samuel. Behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. It's interesting to think about, just the timing of it all. Here he was ready to make a sacrifice, and Samuel wasn't there whenever Samuel said he was going to be there. So Saul instead decides to go ahead and just take care of business on his own. After all, if we're trying to get into Saul's head, he'd already been prophesying, as God had allowed him to do. But he was not just because he prophesied did not make him a prophet per se. So it was not his place. He was definitely not a priest to be offering sacrifices, and it was considered a sin. So another interesting thing here in verse, let's see, what verse is this? Verse 15, and Samuel arose and went up to Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. They went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. The Philistines would have outnumbered them dramatically. I mean, they did not have a large encampment of men here. Yet Saul's son Jonathan, on chapter 14, verse 1, one day Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. I mean, that's kind of crazy talk. And what would actually end up happening is Jonathan would go across and end up killing several men. I think it was 20 men in the verse 14 of chapter 14. And that first strike, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, killed about 20 men within as if it were half a furrow's length in an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders them trembled, and the earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. So the camp of the Philistines goes into wild disarray, and the Philistines end up being defeated here. Saul mobilizes the army here at the last moment and makes a vow that no one shall eat until this army is run down. We see in verse 34, and Saul said, "Disperse yourself among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep," this is after the victory, "and slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood." So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. So we see here the first altar that Saul builds to God. They would continue to fight. There's always going to be kingdoms that want to take over your territory, and it was no different in the case of Israel. But Saul was really not very pleasing to God, and we see that in chapter 15, verse 4. So Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men of Judah. He's bringing a much larger army this time when he goes fighting the Amalekites, and God commands him to destroy everything of the Amalekites, the king, all of it. Just like whenever they were going into the land of Canaan, and they didn't really do exactly what God had planned for them this time either. In verse 22, and Samuel said, this is Samuel talking to Saul, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry, because you have rejected the word of the Lord. He's also rejected you from being king. So we see here the rejection of Saul as king of Israel. Hold on one sec here.
Sorry,
so in verse 34, then Samuel went to Ramah, and once again, his favorite place. And Saul went up to the house in Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So at this point, the only person really kind of happy that Saul is king is Saul himself, of the three important parties here. It's interesting that when you're reading the story, David is actually anointed as king multiple times. And the first one we find here in chapter 16, verse 13. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So Samuel at this point looks like he's operating out of his home base there in Ramah. David would then go on to work in Saul's service. He would fight Goliath and win. We're all very familiar with that story, most likely. He would become very good friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And Saul would become very jealous of David, and that would not end up working out well for them, their relationship. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Saul really kind of becomes the champion. David becomes the champion for Saul here. Not through any intention, I don't think, but just Saul put him in a place where that's what would happen. And I don't think that he put him there out of good intentions either. I mean, if you're putting him in charge of this company, the idea would be to that he may not live very long to see the rewards. But he did, and he ends up marrying Michal, which is one of Saul's daughters. So we see here Saul entering through marriage into the royal family there in Israel. Saul tries to kill David multiple times. Jonathan ends up warning David of all the plots. And then in verse 30 of chapter 20, then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." Clearly Saul is trying to establish his kingdom, and he's upset with his son because his son keeps interfering. The son's doing the will of the Lord, though, so it's for what's best. David ends up fleeing. He does not really, there's no safe place for him anywhere. Saul will find him wherever he finds him. And we see through here in chapters 22 and 23 that David he's pursued constantly by Saul. He has the opportunity to kill Saul and chooses not to. That's another example of great faith. He looks at Saul as the anointed one of God. And what place does he have to kill this anointed one of God? In chapter 25, in chapter 25, we see Samuel's death there in verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. So you can see here this is the end of Samuel and his influence on the kingdom there. Next, we have the story of David and Abigail. David has the chance to kill Saul again and chooses not to. And then finally, it gets so bad that David has to flee to the Philistines. It's an interesting thing there. When we think about the mortal enemy of the Israelites, the Philistines are it. And here David finds it so hostile in his own place that he ends up going over and being with them. Give me just a second. All right, so let's see here. So chapter 27, verse 1, then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, and he and 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, and he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. We'll find out that he later goes on to become the personal bodyguard of the guy who took him in. Let's see, Achish of Gath. So he ends up being this guy's personal bodyguard. Him and his 600 men. Saul, very troubled at this point, ends up going to the medium at Endor, the witch at Endor. Don't really know which it is. Depends upon your translation, I suppose. The Philistines find out that David is in their camp, and they know about David's reputation. And in chapter 29, verse 6, Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign, for I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me this day. Nevertheless, the Lords do not approve of you." So his contemporaries, that's Achish's contemporaries, said, "Look, you got to get this guy out of here. He's not a friend of ours." David's wives end up being captured in chapter 30, verse 5. David's two wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam and Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because of all the people were bitter in soul, for each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David ends up going on and defeating the Amalekites. And then in chapter 31, we see the death of Saul. It's not until we get into 2 Samuel that we see David finding out about Saul's death. And this is the person who has pursued him so vehemently that he had to actually seek shelter with his enemy. In verse 11 of chapter 1, then David, and this is how he reacted when he found out about what happened to Saul. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am a son of the sojourner in Amalekite." David said to him, How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go, execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." The idea here that he was obviously distraught over the death of the king. He ends up having the person that ended up slaying the king killed as well. So he was definitely not happy about what happened, even though Saul had given him so much trouble. David's first anointed king of Judah in chapter 2. We see that starting in verse 1. After this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the town of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So we see, it's interesting here. We start to see the division in Israel, because in verse 8, Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead and of the Asherites and Jezreel, and Ephraim and Benjamin and all of Israel. So we see the division really begin here. And when we think about the dysfunction that is Israel, this is really where it starts to take hold. So this dysfunction will continue on. And I know when I was being raised and learned these stories, it's not very commonly known. I mean, that David has a rough time of it, but we don't typically teach children about really how dysfunctional the kingdom of Israel is until we get to the divided kingdom for whatever reason. The reality is the kingdom of Israel, as we read here in 2 Samuel, was just incredibly dysfunctional its entire time. There was really almost no consistency. David would he would eventually consolidate his reign, but until that happened, it was just complete chaos with who was going to be king. Abner ends up joining David. Oops, my program collapsed again. Give me a moment. Chapter 3, Abner joins David, and then Joab ends up murdering Abner. David isn't happy about that. He's going to mourn his death. And then Ishbosheth will be murdered in chapter 4. And in chapter 5, we start to see the uniting of the kingdom under David. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be a shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed King David over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah 33 years. So we see here that period of dysfunction that Israel has to go through is clearly defined and how long it would last. David ends up going on to defeat the Philistines, and he has the ark brought back. Then we have the famous story of Uzzah. Everybody, that's a popular Bible class story as well. Uzzah returning the ark, reaches out to stop it from falling, and is struck dead because the Israelites were not carrying it properly. One of the things that we don't get a lot of insight into until this 2 Samuel chapter 6 really is the Michal, the daughter of Saul, one of David's wives, and how much contempt she had for him. Verse 16, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. And then all the people departed, each to his house. Let's just keep reading. Verse 20, and David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. So she would not continue on that lineage of Saul. David continues on as a successful king. He ends up blessing the house of Saul, specifically Mephibosheth, who is the grandson of Saul. And he ends up giving him basically Saul's riches and passing that on to him. You remember that Saul was not a poor man whenever he entered, whenever he became king. Saul's father was a wealthy man, so it wasn't from poorness that, or his family had wealth to it already. David defeats Amnon in Syria, and then we have the problem of Bathsheba. One of the things I've always found interesting about the story of Bathsheba, if we skip to the end of it, because this is a story that is very familiar. In verse 24, then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went into her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet. So he called his name Jebedah, because of the Lord. It's interesting when you think about people like Ruth and people like Bathsheba, and how the Lord takes things that are not ideal and turns them to his advantage. Ruth's situation would have been considered one of despair even. And Bathsheba, how much she's responsible for the situation that she's in, I do not know. But at the same time, what she would have to go through to have a son that would be the son of David, she lost a son as a result of their sin before that, and that trial she still ends up in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Next, we have Amnon and Tamar. That's another very common story to tell, so we'll skip over it. Absalom returns to Jerusalem. He's really I mean, in chapter 15, you even read about the conspiracy of Absalom, and David ends up having to flee the city. It's interesting when you look at chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, verse 5. When King David came to Bahurim, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. And as he came, he cursed continually, and he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David, and all the people, and all the people, and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And Shimei said, as he cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. We can see here that they revert so quickly back to that division of the kingdom that took place, and just immediately makes reference to Saul and how he is, he was the first king. David ends up being saved from the hand of his son Absalom, and Absalom is killed. Of course, any father is going to, really mourn over the loss of his child, and David's no different here, even though Absalom was not a child that was one that would be, he wasn't the greatest son. But David's still grief-stricken over the loss of his son. David ends up returning to Jerusalem, and as an act of kindness, pardons all of the enemies that had sided with him. And yet there would still be this problem of rebellion, which we can see in chapter 20. Now there happens to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Berchi, a Benjaminite, and he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his tents, O Israel. If you remember, Solomon was of the house of Benjamin, not Solomon, Saul was of the house of Benjamin. So we see, once again, this constant separatist type movement going on throughout the book of 2 Samuel. David goes to war with the Philistines again. He ends up being delivered and writes a fairly long song of deliverance. And then in chapter 3, we see the last words of David that are recorded here. And we have in chapter 24 the census of David. That God is not happy that David decided to count the people. And so he has to ask forgiveness, and God does. He does ask forgiveness there in chapter 24 as well. Next, we move into 1 Kings. We have David in his old age here in 1 Kings. It's how many people think that they can just take the king of Israel's spot in chapter 1, verse 5. Now Adonijah the son of Haggith exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. His father had never at any time displeased him by asking, why have you done thus and so? He was a very handsome man, and he was born next after Absalom. He conferred with Joab the son of Zeruiah and with Abiathar the priest, and they followed Adonijah and helped him. But Zadok the priest and Benaiah son of Jehoiada and Nathan the prophet and Shemiah and Rias and David's mighty men were not with Adonijah. So Adonijah tries to set himself up as as the next king. That also does not work out. These people could not seem to figure out that God is the one that appoints the kings for them. Let's see here. All right. In verse 28 of chapter 1, Solomon will be appointed king, and David instructs Solomon, and then we see the death of David here. Solomon's reign is established. The famous story in chapter 3, really, that Solomon's probably most well known for, being the prayer for wisdom, and God grants him riches and wisdom as a result of it. And then we see examples of Solomon's wisdom in that chapter as well, where he talks about the division of the infant, because one of the mothers, each who had their own infant, rolled over on one, and so there was only one infant left between the two of them. He says, well, let's just cut it in half and give each of you half. And the mother of the infant says, yeah, that's not a good idea. And the one that's not the mother of the infant says, sure, I'll take half. So he knows instantly who the mother really is. Solomon's wealth would be literally the greatest ever to be amassed. It's something we looked at in a Bible class recently, and it was just the amount of money that was there in the kingdom was just unreal. We talked about streets lined with gold, and silver was so common that it would have been used as a material to be walked on in this time. So it's just something that we can't even really begin to fathom how much money and wealth was accumulated by this tiny little kingdom. And we can read about all that here in 1 Kings. In chapter 6, he goes over the temple building, and then shortly thereafter, Solomon builds his palace and then furnishes the temple. The ark is brought into the temple in chapter 8. And we see it's interesting here, a blessing to the Lord. In chapter 8, verse 12, and Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have indeed built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. Then the king turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel, and all the assembly of Israel stood. And he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to David my father, saying, since the day that I have brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. Now it was in the heart of David my father to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to David my father, whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son who shall be born to you shall build the house for my name. Verse 20, now the Lord has fulfilled his promise that he made, for I have risen in the place of David my father, and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and I have built the house for the name of the Lord and the God of Israel, and there I have provided a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our fathers when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. So we really see here kind of the climax of the end of we've made it. We started off in Egypt as slaves, and now here we are with the Ark of the Covenant at the temple that Solomon has built. Next, we have the dedication of the temple. The Queen of Sheba we read about in chapter 10. This would actually end up being a large source of Solomon's wealth. When we think about how much would you pay for the right answer every time, that's something that has a lot of value to it, and people would come from all over the world to seek Solomon's advice. The Queen of Sheba being no different there. The amount of gold just that she brought alone is estimated to be in the trillions. So it's not some small sum of money that she brought. So she blessed Israel significantly, and specifically Solomon. But Solomon would not remain he would not always follow his wisdom that he had, and he would end up dividing the kingdom because of his actions. And we start to see that in chapter 12, verse 16. And when all of Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do you have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel, who lived in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam set Adoram, who was a taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot and flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And when all of Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. there was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. So we see the true division at this point. The rumors of it, or so to speak, the whisperings of revolution have taken place, and the kingdom is divided. Jeroboam turns out to be not a very good king, and neither is Rehoboam for that matter. And that really gets us to chapter 15. In chapter 15, we see the reign of Abijam and the reign of Asa. None of these kings would really turn out to be tremendous kings for Israel. Really, the ultimate kind of pinnacle of the kingdom of Israel would happen right here in this time frame that we've read today in this last week. So we would see with the building of the temple, the glory of all the wealth that they would accumulate, and David is king, God's anointed king there. Those are the only real times that Israel would truly flourish, so to speak. So that's really about all that we have for the reading this week. Next week, let's see, let me pull it up here real quick just to review. Next week we will pick up in, I already started 15, so I already did a little bit farther. But we'll pick up in 1 Kings 15, and we will read all the way through 2 Chronicles chapter 13. So if you are interested in joining us, we would love to have you. Feel free to invite your friends and tell them about the great learning that we are achieving here through studying God's Word. It's been great talking to you tonight, and I hope that this has encouraged you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.